Family isn't a carefully curated, heavily edited photograph in a lifestyle magazine. Family is the people who will physically shield you from the freezing wind when the storm finally hits. And if someone intentionally brings the storm inside my own house, I will tear them out by the roots. My name is Will Hayes. I am 44 years old, and I make my living with my hands. I'm a custom carpenter and an independent contractor. My knuckles are permanently scarred. My fingernails are usually packed with sawdust, and my everyday uniform consists of steel-toed boots and a heavy, insulated Carhartt jacket. I am a man built for the physical elements, accustomed to carrying the weight of a heavy load without complaint. But as I navigated my battered Ford 250 through the blinding, whiteout conditions of a brutal Denver blizzard on the evening of December 14th, the only thing on my mind was the warmth of my home. Because the weather had deteriorated into a severe winter warning, the construction site foreman had sent everyone home 3 hours early. It was exactly 7 o'clock when I finally turned onto my affluent, snow-covered street. My house was a sprawling, modern craftsman that I had spent the last 2 years renovating from the studs up. But I didn't renovate it just for myself. I rebuilt it for 2 people, my wife, Vanessa, and my younger brother, Toby. Vanessa is 33, a woman whose entire existence revolves around aesthetics, social climbing, and presenting an absolutely flawless facade to her wealthy circle of friends. Tonight was her crown jewel, an exclusive, catered holiday dinner party designed to impress the most influential wives in our neighborhood. For weeks, she had obsessed over the linen napkins, the crystal wine glasses, and the precise arrangement of the floral centerpieces. Toby, on the other hand, doesn't care about crystal or centerpieces. He is 38 years old, but due to severe autism and a childhood accident that left him permanently confined to a wheelchair, his mind and heart operate with the pure, untainted innocence of a 10-year-old. He is incredibly sensitive to loud noises and freezing temperatures, but he has the gentlest soul of anyone I have ever known. His greatest joy in life is sitting quietly in the corner, meticulously assembling elaborate Lego sets. I promised our mother on her deathbed that I would always protect him, a vow I take more seriously than my own heartbeat. When I married Vanessa, I foolishly believed her when she said she could handle my baggage. I thought the friction between them was just a necessary adjustment period, but I should have recognized the warning signs. Just that morning, before I left for the job site, Vanessa had stood in the kitchen, sipping her espresso, her face twisted in a mask of absolute disgust. She was glaring at the faint, temporary rubber tracks Toby's wheelchair tires had left on the hardwood floors I had just spent a week hand polishing. "He's going to ruin the ambiance, Will," she had snapped, her voice carrying a sharp, venomous edge. "I have the mayor's wife coming tonight. I cannot have Toby rolling around the dining room, making those weird humming noises and dropping his plastic toys everywhere. It's an eyesore. He needs to stay locked in his room." Toby had been sitting at the kitchen island, his shoulders hunched, staring silently down at his lap, gripping a half-built Lego spaceship. It broke my heart. I had firmly told Vanessa that Toby lived here too, and that he wouldn't bother anyone. I kissed her cheek, told her to have a good party, and left for work, assuming the matter was settled. I was an idiot. I pulled up to the edge of my property. Through the thick curtain of falling snow, I could see the golden light spilling from the massive dining room windows. I could faintly hear the elegant notes of a classical piano playing through the expensive sound system I had installed. The driveway was entirely packed with pristine Range Rovers, gleaming Mercedes sedans, and luxury SUVs. I didn't want to ruin Vanessa's perfectly curated driveway with my muddy, snow-covered work truck, so I parked halfway down the block in the communal neighborhood lot. I stepped out of the truck. The wind was howling, a vicious, icy bite that instantly penetrated the thick canvas of my jacket. The temperature had plummeted to a bitter -2 degrees Celsius, and the forecast warned it would only drop further. I pulled my collar up, trudging through ankle-deep snow toward my house. To avoid tracking dirty slush through Vanessa's immaculate foyer and disrupting the high society gathering, I decided to use the side entrance. I walked down the narrow, dark path on the side of the house, my boots crunching heavily against the frozen gravel. This path led directly to the detached, unheated garage, a space currently freezing because I was in the middle of replacing its vac unit. I reached the heavy metal side door, my fingers numb as I punched my 4-digit code into the electronic keypad. The lock clicked green. I grabbed the frozen metal handle, completely unaware that I was about to walk into a nightmare that would permanently alter the course of my life. The heavy steel door swung outward, catching a violent gust of wind. I stepped inside the garage and pulled it shut behind me, instantly cutting off the aggressive howl of the blizzard. It was pitch black, and the air inside was a stagnant, freezing vault. Because I had ripped out the insulation 2 days prior for the FAC renovation, the temperature in the room was easily -2 degrees. I reached blindly for the light switch on the wall, but before my fingers found the plastic toggle, a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't the settling of old wood or the wind rattling the exterior siding. It was a rhythmic, frantic clicking, the sound of human teeth chattering uncontrollably. Beneath it was a soft, ragged intake of breath, a muffled, desperate whimper of someone trying very hard to cry without making a sound. I slammed the heel of my hand against the light switch. The overhead fluorescent tubes buzzed, flickered, and finally bathed the concrete floor in a harsh, pale light. My eyes adjusted, and then my heart completely stopped beating. In the furthest corner of the garage, wedged between a stack of raw drywall and my heavy table saw, sat a wheelchair. Curled into the tightest ball physically possible was my brother. Toby wasn't wearing a winter coat. He didn't even have a sweater. He was wearing the thin, short-sleeved plaid cotton shirt I had helped him button that morning. His arms were wrapped tightly across his chest, his hands clutching a tangled mess of broken, brightly colored plastic. It was his Lego spaceship, completely shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. Toby's head was tucked down, but when the light hit him, he looked up at me. His lips were a terrifying, oxygen-starved shade of blue. His skin was as pale as marble, and the tears that had streamed down his face were literally freezing onto his cheeks. My brain misfired. I couldn't process the geometry of the situation. Toby couldn't open the heavy, dead-bolted interior door that led from the kitchen mudroom to the garage on his own. He physically lacked the strength to turn the mechanism from his wheelchair. I took 2 slow, heavy steps toward that interior door. I stopped. The heavy weather stripping at the bottom of the frame was missing. I had removed it yesterday to sand the threshold. Through that half-inch gap, the sounds of my own house bled into the freezing garage. I could hear the warmth. I could hear the lively, elegant jazz music playing on the Sonos speakers. And I could hear my wife. Vanessa was standing just on the other side of the door, in the mudroom, likely fetching another bottle of wine from the reserve cooler. She wasn't alone. I heard the unmistakable voice of her best friend, a real estate agent named Claire, asking a question. "Hey V, where did you stash your brother-in-law? I thought you said he was going to be a total nightmare tonight." I stood frozen, the freezing concrete beneath my steel-toed boots feeling like it was crumbling into a void. I waited for my wife, the woman I had married, the woman who swore she would embrace my family, to say he was upstairs watching a movie. Instead, Vanessa let out a light, airy laugh, a sound so casual and cruel it made the blood run backward in my veins. "Oh, Toby?" "I put him in the garage," Vanessa said, the clinking of a wine bottle against glass echoing through the gap. He knocked over a crystal wine glass in the kitchen and started whining about the noise. "He's such an eyesore, Claire. I couldn't let him ruin the aesthetic of our party, especially with the mayor's wife sitting in the dining room. He can survive a few hours in the cold. It'll toughen him up." I didn't kick the door off its hinges. I didn't scream her name or pound my fists against the wood. When a man who builds foundations for a living realizes his own house is built on a toxic swamp, he doesn't throw a tantrum. He prepares for demolition. The exhaustion in my bones entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. I turned my back on the door and walked over to my brother. Toby flinched slightly as I approached, his terrified eyes darting from my face to the broken plastic in his hands, expecting to be yelled at for being a burden. I didn't say a single word. I ripped the heavy, insulated Carhartt jacket off my shoulders and immediately draped it over his violently shivering frame. I pulled the thick, fleece-lined collar up around his neck, my rough, calloused hands gently cupping his freezing face. I wiped the frozen tears from his cheeks with my thumbs. "I got you, buddy," I whispered, my voice thick with a dangerous, suppressed gravity. "I'm right here." I didn't bother trying to push the wheelchair through the snow. I reached down, scooped Toby's trembling body into my arms as if he weighed nothing at all, and carried him out of the garage. I walked back into the howling teeth of the blizzard, heading straight for the idling engine of my truck. The walk from the side of the house to my parked truck was a blur of stinging snow and howling wind. I shielded Toby's face against my chest, feeling the terrifying, violent tremors racking his thin body. I reached the EF-250, yanked the passenger door open, and carefully placed him onto the wide bench seat. I reached in, started the heavy diesel engine, and immediately cranked the industrial cab heater to its absolute maximum setting. I dug behind the seat and pulled out a heavy, foil-lined thermal emergency blanket, standard equipment for any Colorado contractor, and wrapped it tightly over my Carhartt jacket that already engulfed him. I grabbed the dented green Stanley thermos from my center console, poured a steaming cup of the sweet, lukewarm coffee I had saved from lunch, and pressed it gently into his freezing hands. For a long time, the only sound in the cab was the aggressive roar of the heater vents and the chattering of Toby's teeth against the rim of the metal cup. Slowly, the color began to creep back into his lips. As his core temperature stabilized, the physical shock gave way to the emotional trauma. He looked down at his lap, where the jagged, brightly colored pieces of his Lego spaceship rested in a pathetic pile. "I made a mess, Will," Toby whispered, his voice trembling, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and tracking through the dirt on his cheeks. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. The music was so loud. It hurt my ears." "Hey," I said softly, reaching out to gently wipe the tears away with my calloused thumb. "Look at me, Tobes. You have nothing to apologize for. What happened in there?" Toby swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the broken plastic. "I went to the kitchen to get my noise-canceling headphones, but the ladies were there. They were laughing so loud. I got scared. I bumped the counter, and the shiny glass fell. It broke everywhere. I made a terrible mess. Every word he spoke was a jagged piece of glass twisting in my chest. Vanessa came in," Toby continued, his breathing hitching into quiet sobs. "She was so mad. Will." Her face was scary. I tried to pick up the glass, but she grabbed my chair. She said I was an ugly monster. She said I was ruining her perfect night. I held onto my ship, but she pulled it, and it broke. He held up a severed plastic wing, offering it to me like a piece of damning evidence against his own existence. "She pushed me into the dark room," he cried softly, wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve. "She locked the door. She said the monsters belong in the dark. I'm sorry, I'm a monster. Will. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." The air inside the cab of the truck suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I looked at my younger brother, a gentle, innocent soul who wouldn't intentionally harm a spider, begging for forgiveness because my wife had systematically stripped away his human dignity over a broken wine glass. She hadn't just exposed him to the lethal, freezing elements of a winter storm. She had looked at a disabled man, a man I had sworn on our mother's deathbed to protect, and deliberately crushed his spirit just so her wealthy friends wouldn't have to look at him. She didn't view him as family. She viewed him as a stain on her Persian rug. My sorrow evaporated instantly. In its place, a cold, focused, and utterly merciless clarity took hold. The foundation of my marriage had just been pulverized into dust. There was nothing left to save, nothing left to negotiate, and absolutely nothing left to forgive. I reached across the console and placed my heavy hand on top of Toby's head, smoothing his messy hair. "You listen to me, Toby," I said, my voice dropping to a low, unwavering register. "You are not a monster. You are my brother, and you are the best man I know. This is your house just as much as it is mine," Toby sniffled, looking up at me with wide, trusting eyes. "Are you mad at Vanessa?" "No, buddy," I lied smoothly, ensuring he felt completely safe. "I'm not mad. I just need you to sit right here. Keep the doors locked and drink your coffee. Can you do that for me?" He nodded slowly. "Where are you going?" "Will." I opened the driver's side door, stepping back out into the freezing teeth of the blizzard. "I'll be right back," I told him, closing the heavy door until it clicked shut. "I just need to go inside and take out the trash." If you believe there is a special place in hell for people who abuse the disabled, let me know in the comments, because I was about to bring hell directly into her dining room. When a contractor discovers structural rot inside a house, he doesn't try to paint over it. He doesn't negotiate with the mold or attempt to reason with the decaying wood. He simply takes a sledgehammer, tears the infected drywall down to the studs, and removes the toxic material from the premises entirely. I didn't walk back to the garage. I walked around the perimeter of my property, letting the freezing snow whip against my face, until I reached the front porch. I pulled my house keys from my pocket and slipped the heavy brass key into the front door. The lock clicked silently. I stepped into the grand foyer. The contrast between the lethal blizzard outside and the suffocating, artificially perfect warmth of the interior was nauseating. The air smelled of expensive vanilla candles and slow-roasted duck. From the dining room down the hall, the muffled sounds of clinking crystal and pretentious, high-society laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I ignored the dining room. I didn't announce my arrival, and I didn't storm in to demand an explanation. I walked directly to the utility closet in the mudroom. I bypassed the standard kitchen trash bags and reached for a heavy cardboard box on the top shelf. Inside were 55-gallon, 3mm thick black industrial contractor bags. They are designed to hold jagged drywall, shattered tiles, and heavy demolition debris without tearing. Tonight, they were going to hold something infinitely more worthless. I pulled 3 massive bags from the roll, tucked them under my arm, and walked silently up the carpeted staircase to the master bedroom. Vanessa's walk-in closet was a shrine to her own vanity. It was a massive, brilliantly lit space lined with custom cedar shelving that I had built for her with my own hands as a wedding anniversary gift. Every inch of it was meticulously organized by color and season. It was a space designed to project the illusion of limitless wealth and flawless taste. I snapped the first heavy black plastic bag open. It billowed with a sharp, industrial crack. I didn't carefully fold her garments. I didn't sort them. I approached the nearest rack, wrapped my thick, calloused arms around a dozen silk dresses, and ripped them off the wooden hangers in one violent, fluid motion. I shoved the tangled mass of imported fabric into the bottom of the trash bag. I moved with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a demolition crew. Next came the designer handbags. Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Prada. Bags that cost more than a month's mortgage. Bags she had obsessively polished and displayed behind glass doors. I swept them off the shelves, tossing them into the black plastic like discarded bricks. The expensive leather folded and crushed under the weight of the garments. I opened the second bag. I walked over to the shoe display. I grabbed handfuls of red-soled Louboutins, strappy Jimmy Choos, and knee-high suede boots. I dumped them in, the sharp heels clattering against each other in the plastic void. I didn't care if the leather scratched. I didn't care if the stilettos pierced the silk blouses. I was gutting the rot from my house. For the third bag, I moved to her vanity. I swept my heavy, scarred hand across the marble countertop, knocking hundreds of dollars worth of imported cosmetics, glass perfume bottles, and gold-plated makeup brushes straight into the heavy-duty plastic. The glass bottles clinked and shattered at the bottom of the bag, bleeding the overwhelming scent of floral perfume into the industrial plastic. Within 10 minutes, the immaculate closet was entirely stripped bare. It looked exactly like what it truly was, an empty, hollow space. I tied the tops of the 3 massive bags into tight, unbreakable knots. I grabbed the heavy plastic necks of the bags, dragging them out of the master suite and down the carpeted stairs. They bumped against the wooden banister with heavy, ungraceful thuds. I reached the front door. I pulled it wide open, welcoming the freezing, howling wind back into the foyer. I hauled the 3 heavy contractor bags out onto the front porch and heaved them directly into a 2-foot-deep snowdrift. They landed with a muffled crunch, immediately beginning to collect a layer of white frost. I left the front door slightly ajar, letting the freezing Colorado air flood into the perfectly heated hallway. Then, I turned around. I looked down at my steel-toed work boots. They were caked in a thick, wet mixture of freezing mud, dirty snow, and corrosive street salt. Normally, I would have meticulously unlaced them in the mudroom to protect the pristine, imported white Persian runner rug that stretched down the central hallway. Tonight, I didn't bother. I took a heavy step forward. The wet mud squelched into the expensive white fibers, leaving a massive, dirty black footprint. I took another step, then another. I left a deliberate, filthy trail of reality tracking straight through the heart of her curated illusion. I stopped directly in front of the heavy French doors leading into the formal dining room. Through the frosted glass, I could see the flickering shadows of the candlelight. I could hear Vanessa's voice, bright and bubbling, regaling her audience with a fabricated story about our perfect marriage. I didn't reach for the brass handles. I simply lifted my heavy, steel-toed boot and prepared to introduce the storm to the party. I didn't reach for the polished brass handles of the French doors. I simply lifted my heavy, mud-caked, steel-toed work boot and drove the heel flat against the center stile where the 2 doors met. The impact sounded like a shotgun blast inside the quiet house. The heavy doors flew outward, the frosted glass rattling violently in their wooden frames as they slammed into the interior walls. The elegant, bubbling conversation in the dining room ceased instantly. The soft, classical piano music playing from the ceiling speakers was suddenly drowned out by the aggressive, howling whistle of the blizzard blowing in from the open front door down the hall. I stepped into the doorway. The visual contrast was absolute. Around the massive, custom-built mahogany table sat 12 people dressed in tailored suits and expensive evening gowns. The table was set with baccarat crystal, polished silver cutlery, and an elaborate centerpiece of white winter roses. In the center of it all sat my wife, Vanessa, wearing a stunning black silk dress, holding a glass of imported Pinot Noir, and standing at the head of the room was me. I wasn't wearing my heavy Carhartt jacket. That was wrapped around my freezing brother in the truck. I was standing in a damp, sawdust-covered flannel shirt. Snow was melting in my hair, dripping down my face. And on my feet were the heavy work boots that were currently bleeding a thick, black mixture of freezing mud and toxic street salt directly onto the pristine, $10,000 white Persian rug. Vanessa's jaw dropped. For a split second, she looked confused, but that confusion rapidly mutated into pure, unadulterated fury. She didn't notice the freezing wind blowing down the hallway. She only saw the mud. "Will, what the hell are you doing?" Vanessa shrieked, her carefully cultivated upper-class accent slipping to reveal the shrill, ugly panic underneath. She slammed her wine glass down, spilling dark red liquid onto the white linen tablecloth. "Look at your boots! You are ruining the carpet! Get out of here right now and go to the mudroom!" She looked at her wealthy guests, forcing a tight, panicked, apologetic smile. "I am so sorry, everyone. My husband he works in construction. He doesn't know any better. I didn't look at her. I didn't acknowledge her tantrum. I took 3 heavy, deliberate steps directly into the center of the room. Squelch, thud, squelch. The black mud stained the white fibers permanently. I looked directly at the woman sitting to Vanessa's right. It was Mrs. Halloway, the mayor's wife, a woman whose opinion dictated the social hierarchy of our entire neighborhood. "Good evening, Mrs. Halloway. Good evening, everyone," I said. My tone wasn't a shout. It was the low, dangerous rumble of a rock slide just before it wipes out a highway. "I apologize for the sudden interruption, and I hope you are all enjoying the roasted duck and the reserve wine." The guests stared at me in stunned, uncomfortable silence. Claire, the real estate agent whose voice I had heard in the kitchen, looked nervously between me and Vanessa. "I am sure my wife has spent the entire evening telling you what a wonderful, compassionate hostess she is," I continued, pacing slowly around the edge of the table, my boots leaving a ring of filth around her perfect party. "But as a contractor, I feel it is my professional obligation to warn you about the structural integrity of this house, specifically the woman sitting at the head of this table." "Will, shut up!" Vanessa hissed, her face flushing crimson. She stood up, trying to grab my arm, but I simply stepped past her, an immovable object. I stopped at the head of the table, resting my scarred, calloused hands on the back of an empty velvet chair. 20 minutes ago, I came home early from my job site because of the blizzard," I announced to the room, my eyes locking onto the mayor's wife. I walked into my unheated, uninsulated garage. The temperature inside is currently -2 degrees Celsius, and sitting in the pitch black, freezing to death, I found my 38-year-old brother, Toby. Toby is severely autistic and confined to a wheelchair. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the dining room. Several guests physically recoiled. "He wasn't wearing a coat," I stated, the brutal facts landing like heavy hammer strikes on an anvil. His lips were blue. His tears were freezing to his face. He was trapped out there because my wife, Vanessa, physically pushed his wheelchair into the dark, locked the heavy deadbolt, and left him to freeze. "And do you know why?" I turned slowly, fixing my gaze on Vanessa. She was physically shrinking, her hands trembling violently. The arrogant socialite was gone, replaced by a cornered rat. "Because he accidentally knocked over one of these crystal wine glasses," I said, tapping the rim of Vanessa's glass. "Because he got scared of the noise. Because she decided that a disabled man was an eyesore who was ruining the aesthetic of her dinner party. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating. The social assassination was instantaneous and irreversible. Narcissists feed on the admiration of others. To have their true, monstrous nature exposed in front of the exact people they worship is a fate worse than physical pain." "Mrs. Holloway slowly stood up. She looked at Vanessa, not with anger, but with a profound, stomach-churning disgust. She carefully placed her linen napkin on the table. "That is the most repulsive thing I have ever heard, Mrs." Holloway whispered, her voice shaking with revulsion. "You locked a disabled man in a freezing garage?" "No, Helen, please, he's lying," Vanessa stammered frantically, tears of sheer humiliation springing to her eyes. She reached out toward the mayor's wife, desperate to salvage the illusion. "Will is exaggerating. Toby likes the garage. He likes the quiet." "It was just for a minute while I cleaned up the glass." "I heard you laughing about it with Claire," I interrupted, my voice cutting through her lies like a steel blade. Every eye in the room snapped to Claire, who immediately turned pale white and backed away from the table, desperately trying to distance herself from the radioactive fallout. "I didn't know he was actually out there," Claire stammered, grabbing her purse. "I'm leaving." That was the catalyst. Chairs scraped aggressively against the hardwood floor. The guests were standing up en masse, grabbing their coats from the backs of their chairs, eager to escape the toxic gravity of my wife. The party hadn't just ended, it had imploded. I reached into the pocket of my flannel shirt. I pulled out the heavy set of spare keys I had grabbed from the mudroom hook. I tossed them onto the center of the mahogany table. They landed perfectly on a silver serving platter with a loud, ringing crash. Vanessa looked at the keys, then at me, her chest heaving with panicked breaths as her wealthy friends filed out the front door into the snow without a single word of goodbye. "Your trash is in the snow, Vanessa," I said, my voice echoing in the suddenly empty room. "You have exactly 1 minute to join it before I call the cops for the felony abuse of a vulnerable adult." There is a distinct, pathetic fragility to people whose entire self-worth is built on the approval of others. When that approval is violently stripped away, they don't fight back. They simply collapse. Vanessa looked at the heavy spare keys resting on the silver platter, then looked up at me. She opened her mouth to argue, to deploy one of her standard manipulative tantrums, but the absolute, cold emptiness in my eyes stopped the words in her throat. She knew I wasn't making a scene. I was delivering an eviction. To ensure the finality of the moment, I pulled my smartphone from my flannel pocket. I opened our banking application, navigated to her supplementary credit cards, and tapped the screen twice. "Your cards are now frozen," I informed her, slipping the phone back into my pocket. "You have 45 seconds before I dial the police dispatcher. Make your choice." A raw, ugly sob tore from her throat. The realization that her wealthy friends had abandoned her, her financial lifeline was severed, and the threat of a felony arrest was entirely real, finally broke her. She didn't bother grabbing her coat from the closet. She turned and practically sprinted out the front door, disappearing into the howling whiteout of the blizzard. I walked over to the grand windows in the living room and watched the conclusion of her flawless evening. Under the pale glow of the street lamp, Vanessa found the 3 massive black contractor bags half buried in the snowdrift. She fell to her knees in the freezing slush, desperately trying to open them to check on her precious designer items. But industrial knots do not yield to manicured fingernails. Defeated, freezing, and utterly humiliated, she grabbed the thick plastic necks of the bags and began to drag them. Her expensive stilettos sank deep into the snow with every step. I watched her struggle down the center of the unplowed street, dragging her ruined vanity behind her like an anchor, heading toward the neon lights of a gas station half a mile away. She had wanted a house free of eyesores. Now, she had the entire freezing street to herself. I walked back to the front door and pushed it shut against the wind. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The lock clicked with a profound, satisfying finality. The silence that settled over the house was no longer heavy or tense. The toxic, suffocating infection had been physically removed. I walked into the kitchen, bypassing the elegant trays of roasted duck and untouched caviar. Toby didn't like fancy food. He liked routine and comfort. I opened the deep freezer, pulled out a simple, thick-crust pepperoni pizza, and slid it into the hot oven. 15 minutes later, I stepped back out into the blizzard, carrying a steaming cardboard box. I pulled open the heavy steel door of my F-150 and climbed into the driver's seat. The industrial heater had transformed the cab into a sanctuary of dry, profound warmth. Toby was still wrapped in my Carhartt jacket and the foil emergency blanket, but his lips were pink again, and the violent shivering had completely stopped. "I brought dinner," I said softly, resting the hot pizza box on the center console. Toby's eyes lit up. "Pepperoni?" "Extra pepperoni," I smiled, opening the lid. We sat there in the idling truck, surrounded by a wall of howling snow and ice, eating hot pizza in complete peace. For the first time all day, the tight, defensive knot in my chest finally unraveled. When we finished eating, I wiped my hands on a napkin and reached across the seat. "Let me see the ship, buddy." Toby hesitated, looking down at the jagged, broken pieces of brightly colored plastic in his lap. Slowly, he handed them over. My hands are thick, heavily scarred from years of gripping hammers, carrying lumber, and working with rough steel. But as I took the shattered pieces of the Lego spaceship, my fingers moved with absolute, microscopic gentleness. I found the broken wing. I aligned the tiny plastic grooves with the main hull and pressed them together. Click. I found the cockpit windshield. I snapped it back over the little plastic pilot. Click. Piece by piece, beneath the warm, amber glow of the dashboard lights, I rebuilt my brother's shattered world. When the spaceship was completely whole again, I placed it gently back into his hands. Toby traced the smooth plastic wings, a brilliant, pure smile breaking across his face. A house decorated with cruelty is just a beautiful prison. Real warmth comes from the people who hold your hand when you're broken. Who would you burn bridges for without a second thought? Share it below. And if you think a protective brother did the exact right thing, tap that like button.